Hello everybody, thank you for coming tonight. It's a bit of a crowd scene, so one of the things I need to do is talk about where the escapes are. There's one in the corner and there was one there. Hopefully we won't need to use them. And we're also being filmed tonight, so I hope that's okay. Firstly, a big thank you to Creative Island Partnership, who've sponsored this talk and continue to sponsor us for the second time. We also get private sponsorship, but it's amazing to have the government support. This is our 10th talk since 2022, and all of the talks have been intended to stimulate discussion around what sort of a place do we want to be living in? You know, what's good, what's bad, what should our future environment look like? Hugh Pearman is a London-based architectural writer. He edited the RIBA Journal and was the architecture and design critic for the Sunday Times for 30 years. Other newspapers he's contributed to include The Guardian, The Observer, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. Hugh was one of the instigators of the RIBA Sterling Prize for Architecture and was appointed MBE in 2019 for services to architecture. I met Hugh in 1988 when he interviewed a few of us budding young architects. We were up to no good outside Nine Elms Cold Store, and Hugh did an article on us in the Sunday Times. I can't tell you how impressed our mums and dads were. Hugh, 36 years later, welcome to Jersey. Thank you.
Yes, I remember that meeting very well, Mike, not least because I fell down a hole, as I remember. I was largely uninjured. Thank you, and thank you very much for coming out to see me here. And you'll be pleased to know this is the last you'll see of this particular font, which, as you see, is the font is chosen because of the title. Not trying to be clever, and that's actually heartfelt. It's not throwaway. I'm going to be taking you through the process of producing a new book that tries to present architecture as built in a particular way, and that way is via the purpose of these buildings and places, their use, and particularly the people involved in getting them built. It's not about style, not about theory. The rationale is that the buildings and places are the clever things. So all I have to do is select and present them. So that's the starting point. Now, as a bit of background, Madonna and Jim Sterling, Sir James Sterling, great British architect, both seen here in 1991. Now, I'm not an architect. My background is in journalism and before that in English literature. I never wrote for Vanity Fair. Probably, sadly, I'm told they paid very well. But possibly I peaked in that year when the editors at the Sunday Times were debating whether to lead the culture section here with someone else's profile of Madonna or mine of Jim Sterling, and they chose Sterling. Now, it just strikes me that that's a good thing for them to have done. It can't have been his looks, really, can it? Look at those fingers, and look at the way they're and that's where a good photographer is such a good thing to have beside you when you're doing an interview with someone, because he's just poised, he's just holding that very delicately with his great big mitts, that pencil. Now, I've sifted architecture by building type before. This is something I produced in the late 1990s, a popular but rather unwieldy book that weighed nearly 3.5 kilos. It was a kind of sampler of architecture worldwide as we approached the millennium. The new book, in comparison, is actually quite portable. No, I don't go back to that. Not much over 1 kilo. However, it does try to do more, deal with architecture across the whole world and the whole of history. So no pressure, but it does mean that I have to be very selective. I think there's only one building that features significantly in both books, and it's this one, which of course you will know very well, the Pompidou Centre in Paris. Back in 1998, it was still hugely important in the story of modern architecture, but starting to ossify, you might have thought by then. It was opened in 1976. It's still mighty important, but now, interestingly, as a historic artefact, I would say. I see this building now as being almost like a World's Fair building, almost like an expo building, which happens to have been built to be permanent. And that's why it has to be refurbished at regular intervals, and it's now about to start another major shutdown for refurbishment. But it was a pivotal moment in post-war architecture, worldwide, in fact. So, here's the book, and I'm sure you'll recognise that introductory image there as the Sydney Opera House. And there's the structure, broken down into 11 building types and 5 case studies per type. But just to pause there for a moment before we get into it, because you have to consider the big beasts of architecture writing, the ones who've come before. As a very wise man, his name was Ian Dury, once said, there ain't half been some clever bastards. And here's the first, Sir Nicholas Pevsner. You know him best, I expect, for his buildings of England and Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Man, though alas not the Channel Islands. Here's a chunk of them on my shelves. So he's known obviously for the buildings of these countries. But here's a key reference, his last book, based on a series of early 1970s lectures he gave at Harvard. This is what later got me into the building types thing. Really interesting book, very academic. And when we're still on the clever bastards, here there's this pair, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. About the same time that Pevsner was interrogating building types, they were famously learning from Las Vegas, is the title of their book. And here are some extracts from it. This book upended architectural criticism by concentrating on the everyday, the throwaway, the garish, the popular. And then there was this guy, Peter Rayner Banham. He was launching his own darts at the architectural establishment, privileging technology, and as you see from the picture, becoming a cult of personality in his own right. An early example of an architecture critic who crossed the divide, becoming a TV personality as well. Trained at the Courtauld in London underneath Sir Nicholas Pevsner, and for most of the rest of his career he was trying to basically disprove everything which Pevsner had taught him. When I first came into this business, a lot of architecture writers modelled themselves on Banham, and I called them the Banhamettes. But finally, that's his book, one of his many books, the first key book, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, trying to talk about architecture almost from an art historical context rather than in the kind of functionalist progression to modernism context, which is what Pevsner was keen on doing. Then there's finally, of the clever bastards, this is Sir John Summerson, seen here in his Soane Museum in London. Now, the others we've seen came to eclipse Summerson, but for me, he's the best writer of them all. If you only read one architecture book, I would say, apart from mine, obviously, read The Classical Language of Architecture. This was based on a series of BBC radio lectures he gave in BBC radio lectures on architecture, which he gave in 1963. And how did they do that? Radio, pictures, what? There were no pictures on the radio, so the BBC published a booklet of images to look at while you listened to the wireless. Brilliant. Later it became the book. And for me, the attraction of this book, as they do look it up, it's quite short, is its extreme clarity. He writes like a dream, does Summerson. And if only we could all write as well as he did. Complex subject, lay audience. So how to structure an architecture book today with the whole of the world and the whole of history to choose from, as well as the legacy of the giants I've just mentioned. You could, anything is possible. How big should it be? How many building types should you do? How many case studies? How do you select them? Luckily, Yale University crunched the numbers, and here they are. Now, these are your parameters. If you're an architect, you know that it helps enormously to have parameters. You're not just designing in space, you're designing in a context. You've got site constraints, you've got the topography of the place, you've got the budget, of course, and you've got the brief from the client. Now, in a way, this is my equivalent. That's the size of it. 200 by 260 millimeters, 256 pages, 70,000 words, 150 images, £30. They said, there you go, Hugh, that's what it's going to be. Now go away and make it all fit. Very, very useful indeed, that. They held me to those parameters very firmly. The result is, as you see, is actually quite diddy compared to a lot of architecture books, and those are by no means the biggest ones I've got. So, the building types. Now, obviously, there could have been many more. There could have been at least 30, in fact. What I chose was 11, which, as you see there, broadly cover where we live, both intimately and in the public realm, how we're taught, where we work, how we get around, how we relax, learn, religious buildings, very important, how we shop. And then gardens. There we are at the end. Gardens aren't architecture, some fools say. They tend not to appear in architecture books that much. Also, what's a garden, what's a landscape? But if they don't have much to do with architecture, then what are these 3 buildings by James Gibbs doing in the gardens of Stowe House in Buckinghamshire? That's at one extreme in that section. That's the whole 18th century English landscape tradition, the eye catchers, the vistas, and so forth. Those landscapes need those buildings in order to function the way that they should. That's at one extreme in the garden section. The other extreme is this. Some of you have doubtless been there, the High Line in New York. Former elevated railway track running through the meatpacking district on the west side of Manhattan. Fell derelict, looked rather beautiful derelict with the wild plants growing up through it. And astonishingly, for New York, campaigners got together to save the High Line and somehow try to keep some of that character of the secret place with the wild plants and so forth, but also make it into a public linear park going about 2.5 kilometres, I think, now that they've finished the upper end of it. Highly architectural. Dilys Cofidio Renfro, the architects who did a lot of the incidental places along the way. So, one of the rules of this book is this very simple one. There are a number of rules which actually guided us as we went along. This one is very simple. All of the architecture shown must be built and must still exist at the time of writing. So there's lots of wonderful projects you could show, but they don't exist anymore, or they never were built in the first place, or whatever. All of these exist, I think, still. So, if you think that's old, and it is, but it's only 2,500 years old, that one, the Erechtheion and the Acropolis in Athens, obviously hugely influential. You see this on churches and civic buildings around the Western world. Whereas this one, coming up now, is more than 5,000 years old. It's the oldest example in the book, the introductory image to the whole book, in fact. It's a temple again, this time on Malta, older than the Great Pyramid, older than all the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. Recognisably architecture, recognisably a building. Post, beam, cladding in a sense, great slabs forming the walls. That's the oldest. This is the newest building in the book, and this was completed only last year. And circular buildings, you don't read the size of them. It's curiously scale this. I don't know if there are any human figures, just as dots down towards the bottom of that. But this is the world's biggest waste-to-energy plant at Shenzhen in China by the Danish practice Schmidt-Hammer Lassen. But it's also, interestingly, a visitor attraction. You can go there, you can wander around the plant, you can see the waste arriving, being burnt, learn about how in an ideal world such plants would not be necessary because you wouldn't have the waste to burn. But we do, and they do, and so there it is. Very interesting building. That's in the industry section, which starts with the earliest iron-framed mill in the world in the 18th century. So here comes another rule. It says 55 buildings on the cover, but not all of them are buildings, or even architecture, really. This is the 17th century Canal du Midi in southern France, built a full century before what we normally refer to in the UK as the Canal Age, a century before. It wasn't an industrial canal, it was a rural canal. And it was all to do with a person, an engineer, self-taught engineer, who thought, I know what I want to do with my life. I want to get that great idea that Leonardo da Vinci had of connecting the Atlantic and the Mediterranean by a canal going through the neck above Spain, and thus avoid all those nasty Spanish pirates who keep on raiding our ships. And he did it in a remarkably short time, actually, but he did need the patronage, which was gladly given, of Louis XIV of France to do it, and his first minister, Colbert. And if you look at that rather lovely map, it's just a half of it, it's the western half of it there, you can see how picked out around the edge of that map, they've got lovely little diagrams of all the engineering structures. And in the top there, you see this flight of locks, which is at Font-Sérain, in plan and in section, just showing how the engineering works, and the other diagrams are doing the same thing. Now, to me, this is as much architecture as anything else, even though technically it's a work of engineering. I don't really make a distinction. It's highly architectural, really. Back in the book, it's not a building, it's Isfahan. It's all of it, from its great period of 400 to 500 years ago, urban planning. And this is the civic section of the book, which is mostly to do with urbanism and with planning. Another one in this section being the New Berlin. Extraordinary, the revitalization that central Berlin has gone through over the last few years, a complete new seat of government, apart, and new cultural buildings and so forth, as much as everything else. But here was Shah Abbas in Isfahan doing all that kind of thing 500 years ago. This next curiosity is another in the urban section. You'll have seen this film, some of you, probably most of you, The Truman Show. Filmed in a real place, which was pretending to be a fake place. The opposite of what normally happens in films, actually, where you work with a set which is pretending to be a real place. This is the other way around. It looks like a set. They did fiddle with it a bit. Here's a plan of it by Leon Krier. Seaside in Florida. It's a real oddity, this place. It's a private residential resort in the Florida Panhandle. But this, I suppose, because it was a private development, was the original built manifesto of what came to be called the New Urbanism movement, which is a lot to do with old urbanism, if you know what I mean. It's just anti-car, it's to do with spaces, small little alleyways, things like that. And whereas new urbanism went on to become associated very much with traditionalism, traditionalist architecture, actually in Seaside, the first one, they weren't so wedded to that. There's a lot of different styles. There's modernist buildings here as well as traditionalist ones, but there is a lot of the vernacular of the Florida coast in there as well, as you saw in those houses with Jim Carrey. So back to gardens. In this case, a Japanese, I think it's probably as far away from buildings as I get in the book, a Japanese temple moss garden in Kyoto. It's as much a human construct as any building, and there are buildings as part of the greater temple complex, of course. They're just lurking in the trees there. Most architecture books are about the high end of things. You look at the good stuff, you don't look at the bad stuff. This was always an issue at the Sunday Times, I recall, where I often wanted to write about the bad stuff. I said, it looks horrible here. And I go, yes, that's why I want to write about it. Because horrible is mostly what we get. But why not do both? This actually caused, I'll show you some examples, this actually caused some grumbling from one of my peer reviewers. This being a book from Yale, it was peer reviewed. Why are you doing this building here? I don't understand. Not that one. That one is high. That's high architecture, and I'm sure you will recognise it, some of you. It's the Tugendhat House, 1930, designed in the late 1920s by Mies van der Rohe. Absolutely incredible for its time. I mean, if you think about this in the late 1920s and look at the size of those sheets of glass overlooking the garden there, and then consider that those sheets of glass slide down into the floor so you can open up the whole space to the garden outside, and that was in the late 1920s. So high architecture, the highest you can possibly imagine perhaps. And there's your low. Now it's an actual Amazon warehouse outside Milton Keynes, halfway up the M1 from London to the north in England. It's in my retail section. The retail section's got a lot of different things from, turn of the century Parisian department stores and so forth onwards. But it's in my retail section on the grounds that it's in such places, after all, that most of us do our shopping these days, even though we never see inside. In fact, you're not allowed to see inside. I have seen inside this one. It was empty, and it's quite extraordinary space. It's not. You don't quite get the scale again on this, but it's very high as well as, and you have to account for the curvature of the earth when you're designing. Honestly, it takes quite a long time to drive past this building, even at motorway speeds. About a quarter of a mile, I think, that building is long. Logistically, it's a marvel. There are different names for different sorts of warehouses, but everything, as you know, is on a 24-hour. Everything must be in stock. Everything must be delivered to those who are on Amazon Prime within a day, and they handle all the returns as well. All done in this place, in one side, out the other. Quite extraordinary, if not necessarily desirable. But why ignore it? There it is. It's everywhere. It's all around us. Now, back on high architecture, this lovely building, it's in Toronto. It's the Indian architect Charles Correa's last building, the Ismaili Centre Prayer Hall in Toronto. Essentially a mosque, though they don't call it a mosque in that particular sect. Beautiful, beautiful place. Quite inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright and a synagogue he did, also clad entirely in glass, back in the late 50s. And then you move from that to this, and this is, back in the retail world, a 15-storey shopping mall in Hong Kong by the Jerdie Partnership. If you go there, and I have been there, look at the length of those escalators there, you don't get shopping malls normally in Europe going above 4 stories, and often not that high. This one's 15. And if you go to that part of Hong Kong, Mong Kok, which is the sort of tumultuous streetscape, which was an inspiration for Blade Runner, you realise that actually you can go scramble up inside their buildings and there's people selling stuff all around you on every level. Height doesn't seem to concern them in the slightest. And this very commercial, very low architecture mall somehow carries some of that spirit forward. It kind of erupts out of Mong Kok. And so is a particular cultural experience, which I was glad I was able to partake in. So in a way, this is what the book's all about. I mean, to put it at its most banal, why does a building for one purpose look different from that for another? And then to go beyond that, and then within that purpose, that type, what's the development? How do buildings develop over time? And why do some people want one type of building rather than another? Same period. This is French chocolate factory, 1872, by Jules Saunier. And this is so 19th century. It's so late 19th century because on the one hand, it's incredibly high tech. If you look at that iron cross bracing, it's actually holding it's a lattice work, physically holding a whole building together. You could take all the masonry down and you'd be left with that lattice work still standing. But also historicists in form and in decoration, those are glazed bricks with the pattern, almost medieval patterning, laid into them at the same time. And you quite often get this in 19th century buildings. They're looking forward and they're looking back at the same time. While that was being built as a factory, this was being built in Milan, and a lot of you will know this, I know. The Galleria in Milan by Giuseppe Mengoni. And I have this in the retail section, the shopping section, but as you know if you've been there, it's mixed use really. There's shops, there's offices, there's clubs. Where that iron balustrade goes round in the middle, above that it's residential. It's civic because it's open at all times to the public, it's not closed off. It's an extraordinary building. It's also quite kitsch, I would say, but also again you see the high tech. That dome was chosen just because it's the same diameter as St. Peter's in Rome. Milan, I think, wanted to compete, but being Milan, they wanted to compete commercially. When you're looking at building use types, it helps to try to track back to find the innovators. Who was it who started something off, had the idea in the first place? Now obviously in most cases there is no convenient start point. There have always been dwellings. If you look at the Neolithic village of Skara Brae in the Orkneys, and you look at a house from Grand Designs, there are recognisable attributes, place to sleep, place to live, place to cook, etc. They've got drains up in Orkney in a Neolithic village, they've got communal meeting places, they've got cupboards, it's all there. But there have always been gardens, there have been places to buy things, there have been places of worship and so on. Public museums, however, for instance, you can date to the 18th century. That's when they really got going. Wasn't really a concept of a public museum before that. In other building types, education, this is where the monks come in, this is why I'm saying monks here. Education, offices, gardens, civic design, even industry. I kept coming across monks. They seem to invent almost everything. That Amazon distribution warehouse, which you saw, is in direct line of descent, for instance, from a medieval tithe barn. What it does is identical, without computers in the case of the medieval tithe barn. Their scriptoria, the monks' scriptoria, are our offices and to some extent also our factories. So good old monks. And in honour of monks, my introductory image to the offices section is this 10th century depiction of a day in the life of people making illuminated manuscripts. Trying to find the name of the place. Yeah, they're in the monastery of San Salvador de Tabara in Spain. I like the fact that they're up to all sorts of things, aren't they? The office section is the guys there sort of illuminating their manuscripts. But there's also got the guy ringing the bells, other people going up ladders, all sorts of things going on there. So it's the people. This actually is what I think, to come back to Amazon, they call a verified reader review. Someone actually bought the book and wrote this. And I do wish I'd said it, actually, in my introduction. There's no pretense that architecture is at heart about anything other than satisfying the human social needs and desires of the makers and the users. No mention of style there, no mention of isms, no mention about theory, no. And that's what the book's all about. It's about how do humans make buildings and why do they make buildings in a certain way at a certain place and in a certain time. And how does that pan out across history. So that's the book. Slight change of gear now, and this is coming to the end. I'm leaving the book to look very briefly at something else I do, which is to chair the 20th Century Society, which is now increasingly becoming the 21st Century Society. But we haven't thought of a better name yet. So there we are. Founded in 1979, originally as the 30th Society. It was an interwar thing by great names, Gavin Stamp, Simon Jenkins, Alan Powers, people like that. Campaigning to protect Britain's modern architectural and design heritage. And this, when you get near to the present, starts to become an interesting exercise because you have to be ahead of public taste to some extent. As we know, the recent past is often the most difficult to judge and the most difficult to really come to terms with. What's good, what's bad. The nearer you get to the present day, the harder that becomes. But you have to do it. You have to sort of say, don't knock that building down because we think that's going to be really important. And if you might not necessarily like that now, but we're pretty sure you will do fairly soon. It's a difficult one to get across sometimes, although as it says there, our remit actually starts in 1914 and extends to the present day. And we're what's termed an amenity society. We have a statutory role. We are consulted by law on applications to change or demolish or whatever listed buildings in our period. And we're actively involved in actually trying to get buildings and often succeeding in getting buildings listed. In order to preserve the best that we have. But because it starts in 1914, we're often associated with, brutalist car parks. Let's save this brutalist car park, it's magnificent. Well, bit of minority taste, some might say, but it's not just that because it covers, interwar Tudor Beetham, Art Deco, traditionalism, and so forth. It's all in that period. Before 1914, it's the Victorian Society. They look after the Edwardians as well. but the long 19th century is deemed to have ended in 1914, and we take it on from there. And it's not just the traditionalism of the past, for instance. The example we show here is on the bottom left there. That's actually Brentwood Cathedral by Quinlan Terry, which was built sometime, I think, in the 1980s, 90s. We pushed to have that listed. I think it's a very interesting example of late 20th century traditionalism. Obviously, probably the longest running campaign we ever had was Battersea Power Station. That went on for decades. Now, brought back into use, and bringing buildings back into use and adaptive reuse does require change. You can't just preserve something as a ruin. There is a ruinist agenda where you don't want anything to be changed, but by and large, we're not of that persuasion ourselves. And then on the right, a key success is recently a building by Sir Michael Hopkins in Nottingham. It was the new offices built in the late 1990s of the Inland Revenue, who have vacated it now. And we desperately wanted and succeeded to get this particular complex listed. It's very interesting in the development of sustainable architecture, naturally ventilated architecture, and of course the Hopkins style. And we're very pleased that it was listed, but also it is now being turned into a campus, part of the campus for Nottingham University. So. And it's not the only example like that. There's a factory by Grimshaw down in Bath for the furniture company Herman Miller, which is now a faculty of the University of Bath. So I think that is one of the most fascinating things about buildings over time. The Uffizi in Florence, for instance, built as Uffizi offices for the civil servants of the time, gradually morphed into being the art gallery, which you know it for today. Fascinating part of the whole thing, although it doesn't help you if you're trying to put buildings into types, because some buildings span types over time. So now, red phone boxes, everybody thinks of the classic George Gilbert Scott red phone boxes. Now, I don't know, to be honest, whether you have those on Jersey, do you? The red telephone boxes of, no. On Underground Heritage, War Memorials, Post-War Memorials, Public Art, it's not just buildings. Interestingly, and this is a hard one when we're talking about the recent past, there are very few examples of the post-privatisation British Telecom telephone kiosks left, because obviously we don't need phone boxes anymore. But we want to preserve one of those late boxes, which aren't nearly as good as the George Gilbert Scott ones, in each country, England, Wales, Scotland, just one. And there are some in absolutely beautiful locations which have been used in films and so forth, which we want to preserve. And I can see it's going to be a bit of a battle, that one, because people think they're rubbish. But they're part of our history. Yes, department stores, leisure centres, and another one which is a tough one to fight in this country, bottom left there, cooling towers. Now, this is the legacy of the fossil fuel age. All of those coal-fired power stations steaming away in the landscape. There's hardly any of them left now. There's only about 2 or 3 still functional, and then only occasionally in the depths of winter. And as with lost coal mines and pithead buildings and collieries, in this country we tend to completely demolish everything the moment it stops being used. So there's very few of these cooling towers now left. They are amazing things. Sir Anthony Gormley, the sculptor, talked about one of my favourites, Drax Power Station, which controversially burns trees now rather than coal. That's got to stop. He described it as a man-made volcano. And it's a very good description of what these places are like. And we believe, and I hope you would agree, that you've got to keep some relic of the fossil fuel age. You don't have to keep it running, but you want to keep it. And in Germany, they actually are quite good at doing this. The some in the Ruhr they've turned into sort of fun parks, amusement parks, mountain climbing centres, all sorts of things like that. So it can be done, but it doesn't so far. We're trying to educate Heritage England about this, that yes, these things are beautiful and interesting and historic. And coming up now, future interests there, millennial projects, by which I mean, the Eden Project, the British Museum Great Court, that rush of lottery-funded buildings which happened about the turn of the millennium, and other buildings reaching the 30-year threshold, because in the UK, post-war buildings are deemed to be eligible for listing once they hit 30 years, with exceptions. If a building is really good and is threatened when it's younger than that, it can be listed when it's younger. The house in the middle, by the way, in case you're wondering, is a house by John Outram in Oxfordshire, the Egyptian House. It's a wonderful place, truly wonderful actually, and he's a really interesting and completely unique architect. And the one on the right at the bottom there, that's a leisure centre. We've had some successes actually getting listed 2 or 3 of the most spectacular leisure centres around the country. Sadly, we couldn't save a leisure centre by the architect of the next building. We have no remit over the Crown dependencies. We operate in the UK, but we are asked to support a listing bid for this cafe here by Will Alsop and others, and succeeded. And it became, for a while, I don't know quite what the youngest listed building in the country now is, but for a while, I think of it as being a bit like a kind of household pet. It's rather cuddly in its way, isn't it? Like Will himself was, actually. That's and I was pleased to go past that today and see it was actually looking rather spruce. It's looking in good nick, I must say. Were it to be necessary, I reckon you could move that, but I think buildings tend to be designed for specific locations and sited and oriented in a certain way because of that. I think that best to keep it where it is, frankly, on that case, but it would not be impossible. But can a listed building be moved? Does it still stay listed if you move it? This doesn't happen very often. I can't say I can give you an answer on that one. The last time I inquired, they said, "Oh no, we had a Finnish sauna in Kent, wooden shack with all its fittings, which was built for the 1948 Olympics. The Finnish team, they had their own sauna there, and it was placed later on, moved to this place down in Kent." And we thought, well, it's amazing. There's very little remaining from the 1948 Olympics, the austerity Olympics, as they were called. And so we succeeded in persuading people to list that. But it's not really used where it currently is. And so we said, well, couldn't you move it somewhere else where people might want to use it? And they said, oh, no, you can't. It's a listed building. So there's some stuff to sort out there, I think. But anyway, there's Will and his lovely little cafe. And that is it. That slide is to tell me that I've finished. So that's the book and that's the other stuff. And if you want to ask any questions about any of this, of course, I'm more than happy to talk with you about it either now or sort of over drinks afterwards. But do fire away if you want to. This is where in all these talks there's a deafening silence.
Thanks, Hugh. I just wanted to give you a little present from our association. It's our 60th birthday book.
Thank you very much.
I was obviously hoping you might give me a copy of your book, but that's fine. Okay, well, that's brilliant. So thank you for that. And we'll just grab a microphone, and thanks so much for offering to take questions, and what a wonderful talk. Thank you.
We've been hearing a lot about Thomas Heatherwick deciding that modern architecture is making us ill and that it's all awful. And I just wondered if you had an opinion on that.
It's a marketing exercise by Heatherwick. And you'll have seen a lot of the... he's done some good buildings actually. Particularly Maggie's Centre in Leeds, which he did, is good. If the rest of you in the room don't know Thomas Heatherwick, very successful designer who is not an architect, and has a massive chip on his shoulder about not being an architect. That's basically the beginning and the end of it. And he produced this book called Humanize, where he's basically saying that he can't bring himself to say that modernist buildings are ugly in a way that traditionalists would tend to do. He says that they're boring, and that they should be much more interesting, and that we should, have lots of detail. His own buildings are actually very, very over elaborate, I would say. Although they have their merits as well. But slightly surprised at the amount of attention he's got for that, given that he's associated with so many failures. The Garden Bridge being a classic example. Luckily, that wasn't built. Other buildings he has built, or buildings or sculptures and things, have fallen to pieces. So I don't think he's got that much of a leg to stand on, but he is certainly very good at promotion. Oh, I should say also that I think that this is a case with a number of designers and some architects as well, which is that he works quite well at small scale, and it gets less good the bigger the scale goes with Thomas. I don't know why that should be. I don't think he can sort of start to fill in the other levels of detail quite so much. Over busy, a lot of his works, yes, but you can't claim that they're not interesting. That's for sure. He's entitled to say whatever he likes.
I suppose I've got a question, Hugh, and in researching your book, how did you navigate through all the sort of architectural fashion that we sort of see in magazines monthly and sort of distill through that?
Well, it helps to sort of the fact that it goes across history. Because after if we're just doing a book about contemporary architecture, if you looked at my 1998 book, for instance, you would find there's an awful lot of time-expired architecture in there. That was the postmodern period, and the best postmodern buildings are now coming through, but it's not necessarily the course of history in its entirety. Whereas the moment you start to look at buildings which are 5,000 years old or even 200 years old, you're into a different way of looking at things, and fashion becomes an unnecessary part of proceedings, really. There's a theatre in there, the Bayreuth Festspielhaus by a number of architects, for Richard Wagner to house his Ring Cycle operas, still there of course, which is totally fascinating and is so completely rooted in the fashions of late 19th century architecture that it's almost comical. But there it is as a moment in time. Oh, I should say that I give every building in a book I assign a style label to. And this is quite fun, because when you're dealing with the older buildings, there are accepted style labels. When you're looking at a new building, you can pretty much make up your own, and so I do. And I urge the readers to do likewise.
Obviously, your book concerns real buildings that are still there, but if you could choose an unbuilt building, so a project, unrealised project, to add to that list, what would it be?
I'm trying to remember the name of it. There's a fantastic Victorian one called something like the Great Circular Railway in London, which was going to go through buildings all the way around London. A huge circle of steam trains puffing through buildings, ventilated to some extent. But a modern version of that is by a living architect, Peter Barber, and he came up with a project, which I think was exhibited at the Royal Academy, called the 100-Mile City. And this is so clever, I will commend it to you. Look up Peter Barber, 100-Mile City, because he was looking at a problem which big cities like London face, which is sprawl. And then if you have something like the Green Belt constraining development in London, should we build on the Green Belt, all these arguments get rehearsed. Peter said, yeah, what you do is you build this massive great wall of buildings, not a defensible wall of buildings, with something like the Grand Circular Railway running round it, which defines the edge of London and is, because it's so long and so big, will contain all the expansion space that you could possibly need for the next God knows how long. You don't need to sprawl at all. And so this great circular building around the whole of London by Peter Barber would be my favourite at the moment, I think.
You've obviously travelled quite extensively. I just wondered out of all of the buildings that you've shown us this evening, which has been the most emotional for you and your favourite?
Emotional. I think that I'm very interested. I didn't show it, sadly. I can perhaps pick up the book and show it to you. I'm very interested in how people now make use of. Let's go back to this. How people now make use of old techniques. Now, I should say now, this is a rare example in the book of one I couldn't actually get to. I would love to, but it's in Burkina Faso, and it's not even in a sort of very accessible part of Burkina Faso either. So this is one I couldn't do. But it's a school by a Pritzker Prize winner, Francis Carré. And if you know Carré or his work, he's now a famous architect. I'm trying to find it. It's in the education section. The Gando Primary School in Burkina Faso, page 68. You could pass it around if you like. He's using the mud brick and corrugated iron. I wouldn't say technology is materials of the place in a really progressive way, which naturally cools the buildings. The roof is a double roof with a space above. There are apertures in the brickwork, and it's not just the way of building the building. It's this one here. You'd have to look at the book to see, but it's also to do with a way of living and a way of planting trees and planting food crops and how you irrigate those food crops. And he comes from a remote village in Burkina Faso, and when he started to get to be famous, he went back there and started to build there and to work with the communities to build. So I think that I suppose what I take from that is that it's not just all about, you'll notice that I quite often avoid glitzy, show-off buildings. I quite often have quite humble buildings in this book, and this is a very humble little school. Very successful, he's now done a secondary school and so forth there as well. In a desperately poor part of the world, which is politically volatile at the best of times. So you can produce good architecture anywhere and at any cost, I suppose. That's what that one says. But I am fond of, I don't have a favourite. I am fond of the way a place can evolve. An example here I put in the education section, so as different as you can possibly imagine from that primary school, is St John's College, Oxford. Because it begun by monks, I should say, because it was the first Oxbridge college to embrace modernism, and they've done it in a very sort of selective and very careful way with some very good architects. Right up to the present day, they've got a building here by a library by Claire and Sandy Wright. So I think that development over time in a single place is another fascinating thing. You know, you're not just looking at a building; you're looking at a complex which develops.
You've already demolished Thomas Heatherwick.
I didn't demolish him. I was just suggesting he might have motives other than the purely altruistic.
If I can also invite you to demolish Santiago Calatrava, but before that, if I can just tell you a brief story told to me by our patron, the patron of the AJA, who, when head of the British Council in India, was aware that the Swedish government gave a grant to India, vast amount of money to build an energy for waste or energy from waste plant. You showed us a similar one tonight. And at huge expense, major aid effort, this plant was built outside Delhi and opened, and they waited for the waste to arrive. And, of course, no waste arrived because everything that could be recycled had already been recycled. But back to Santiago Calatrava, can we have your opinion of him, please?
Well, I've been to a number of his buildings. One thing I will say about Calatrava, something I say to architecture students, I say, don't be tempted by too many moving parts. I mean, obviously all buildings have got moving parts. They've got doors, they've got things like, they've got windows. Bits of buildings do move, but the way some Calatrava buildings have whole sections which open up, you're just asking for something which is going to go wrong there. Well, he is, in a sense, more of a sculptor than an architect. And I'm not going to completely dismiss him, because I don't think any more in a way you can completely dismiss Heatherwick. These people have got enormous talent. Calatrava's buildings, I think, fall into that overblown category that you will not find your answer may be that you don't find a Calatrava building in this book, actually. Not to my taste, I think. If you know Calatrava, they do tend to be bony, and some of them are lovely. He's done 1 or 2 really lovely stations and airports and so forth, so I'm inclined not to dismiss him entirely, but I think that he's another of these people whose buildings tend to go wrong a bit. Another thing to be aware of, I guess. That's actually an important point, I think, that modernists can learn from traditionalists. We really do need buildings which can last, can erode, can get dirty, and can be patched up quite easily. And I think that there's some kinds of architecture which can do that, and other types of architecture which can't so well. Yes, long life, loose fit, low energy. Well, that was a mantra, wasn't it? Still is.
Hugh, I'm very pleased that you went to see, or that you have seen, Will Alsop's La Frégate on your way here. And I'm wondering if on your way from the airport you passed any of our local bunkers built during the Second World War, made of concrete. And I remember a photographer telling me that she was taking a picture of one of our sea walls made of concrete, and which she found rather beautiful. And somebody said, "Why are you taking that? It's concrete." And concrete buildings are unloved in Britain, and our bunkers are unloved in Jersey, but they represent part of our history. And some of them are quite spectacular. There are several tall towers, which are range-finding towers, which are really quite spectacular. And I'm thinking of your connection with the 20th Century Society. I wondered if you could give us any advice about how to get people to love concrete.
Well, there's good concrete and bad concrete, and I think the problem is that the public view tends to put it all together. So, in English terms, bad concrete would be a panel system precast concrete council tower block which starts to fall to pieces like Ronan Point, and good expensive concrete would be the National Theatre. And they're not the same thing. They just are so not the same thing. And it's a bit like saying I hate brick, or I hate timber, or I hate or whatever. There's nothing hateful about the material. As enough people have said, the Pantheon in Rome is made of concrete. I think that it is associated with fortifications, particularly the brutalist use of concrete. With regard to Jersey and those fortifications, I think you have to look at it in the same way as you look at the spectacular ruined castles of the Welsh border and across Wales. Huge tourist attractions which actually were built to subjugate the inhabitants. But it's sufficiently far back in history for that to have become less of an issue for the Welsh or the English. And one hopes that in time the same will apply here. And anyway, they cost an awful lot to get rid of, wouldn't they? I'm not even sure you can. Make the most of them. Yes, it's all part of that business of the recent past being the diciest, to try to persuade people of the merits of, or even to see the merits yourself, to be honest.
Hi. Your book covers a vast period of architectural history, clearly, from what you presented to us tonight. I'd just be interested to know what period of architectural history is your favourite. We all have some favourites which influence the work that we do, but also things like when we go on holiday, we go and visit things to go and see. Often you pick the ones that are favourite to you. So I'd just be interested to know, what is your favourite period of architecture?
I have to be careful here. As the chair of the 20th Century Society, 20th century actually is covers all the styles, you see, so I would have to say that. But I think that having read, for instance, I regard him as being a kind of you could argue he's an early modernist. If you've ever read the autobiography of Sir George Gilbert Scott, the great Victorian architect, St Pancras Station, Foreign Office and so forth, there's some fabulous bits in there about him as a young man trying to get work at the time when the Workhouses Act came in. And suddenly every parish in the country wanted to build a workhouse. And he recounts, this is pre-railway age, and he recounts how he and his partner, Mr. Moffat, they would go to a particular club in Fleet Street where he had all the regional and local newspapers from all over the country, came in every day. They'd sit down, they'd look through all the newspapers, and they'd find some advertisement from some parish council, sort of, architects wanted for workhouse, apply to parish, They would then jump onto an overnight stagecoach. Moffat went west, Scott went north. On the outside of the stagecoach, huddled in their coats, it's like some kind of sort of period drama. Arrive in Lichfield or Belper or wherever it may happen to be, Chesterfield, in time to meet the parish council the next morning and get the commission before any of their rivals were even out of bed. And I think that that moment of that was early Victorian, but once you get onto the high Victorian period, I think there was just such exuberance and dynamism going on there that it would be, if one could time travel, that would be one of my choices. But I think my favourite would be actually the early to mid-50s, the post-war reconstruction, the schools, the social housing and so forth. I'm torn between LCC housing of the interwar period or what was going on in the post-war period, but to have been there at that time and seeing what was being done when Park Hill in Sheffield was being built. And these, the work of giants, one might almost say. You don't do it like that anymore. Would it be great to just be there and experience that going on, I think. Don't really have favourites because, it's all monks, really. Okay, I'll name a brutalist one for you. And it is a personal favourite because I was associated with it, I suppose, and that is, if you know the city of Durham in northeast England, obviously the Norman Cathedral is a high point, but to me it was one of the things which put me onto architecture, which is you had a number of styles and periods very happily coexisting there. And I was in a 1960s traditionalist college. There was a modern Gothic public library university library nearby, done by George Pace, great architect. There was an OV-Arup footbridge across the river. There was a brutalist student union the other side, Dunelm House. That mixture of periods and styles in a UNESCO World Heritage Site, I should add, actually, to me, probably stimulated, because I was there for 3 years, stimulated my interest in architecture in the first place, I suspect. So I'll name that as my favourite because that covers all the periods.
Hugh, just having read much of what you've written over the past probably 20 years and your books, and looking at the 55 buildings in this book, clearly there's an element of joy in whichever period you're looking at, in the good buildings and perhaps the problems of the bad. If you were to have a crystal ball and look ahead, where do you see the joy and both the problems coming in the future for our future designs? And
I'm worried by the lowest common denominator aspect to building today. I know firms of architects who are actually closing down their practices because they can't hack it any longer, with the undercutting, with the amount of work they're being asked to do for free, and so forth. And I think it's actually reaching something of a low point. But I'm encouraged by the fact that despite all of this going on, you still see some fabulous buildings appearing. So it is possible to buck the system. And I think it's that sort of, architects are clever. They're really clever people. They're clever bastards. And they can actually get round stuff. They can find ways, they can dodge, they can duck and weave in a way which I admire enormously. And so I think that finding ways around these problems, there's bureaucracy, there's insurance, there's all kinds of things which make it difficult to design buildings, apart from all the usual ones. And I think that perhaps I'm talking more for the UK. Maybe it's not so much of a problem here, but it's certainly a problem there that we don't value what architects do nearly enough in the way that they do in Italy, in Germany, in France, for instance, in Japan, and increasingly in Africa. So I'm worried about the fact that we don't care enough about quality to encourage the best architects. And also, you've got to pay for it. Honestly, you have got to pay for it if it's going to be any good at all. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in a cycle of buildings which everyone's going to be knocking down after 25 years. And the future demands buildings which last for hundreds of years. The longer a building lasts, obviously, the more sustainable it is. Got to be adaptable, got to be made of good materials, got to be able to be patched up. And that is something which requires a certain level of investment in design, in talent, and in money at the outset. That sounds a bit grim, doesn't it?
Perhaps as a follow-up then, what are your thoughts on retrofit?
It's absolutely necessary, and the examples I was giving there of that Hopkins building in Nottingham, for instance, or the Grimshaw building in Bath. If you, I mean, it was a forgotten, I can't even remember his name myself now, some RIBA president who came out with the mantra of long life, low energy, loose fit. He did that in the early 70s, even before the oil crisis. He came out with that. But it's such a good mantra. If you can adapt the building for other uses, then you've got a chance of it having a long life. And if you have a long life, then, you know, your sustainability aspects go up and up and up. I worry a lot about buildings which depend upon sheets of double glazed glass and mastic joints. They can be replaced. They just need recladding every few years, but that's not a sustainable way of proceeding, in my view. Doesn't mean a lot of those buildings aren't very good buildings. Pick up your book. Available from all good retailers.
No. Thank you, Hugh. That's tremendous. Just if I could very quickly just let you know the next 4 talks that we're hoping to get organised. The first one is a talk by an engineer, a structural engineer who does roof conversions in London. He does lots of things, but one of the things he does is roof conversions in London using no steel and no concrete. So everything is timber, super lightweight. It's just very interesting, I think, possibility. We've got the first female motorcyclist that circumnavigated the globe, potentially. I'm trying to think of the third one, but we've also got, it will come to me, we've got, I know exactly what we've got. We've got an internationally acclaimed author who writes amazing thriller novels set in the Raj period in India. And then finally, we're trying to organise getting a West Midlands artist who deconstructs training shoes into amazing sculptures, and that's all to do with reuse. So that's kind of what's on the horizon. Thank you, Hugh. Amazing talk. Thank you so much. But most importantly, thank you to all of you for coming, and do please stay in touch. And thank you.